on that point. We are failing our children to insist that our government live within its means, within our means. And one of the key ways that our debt is going to spiral even more out of control is through radical environmentalism, because this administration, this White House administration, is all on board with all that the United Nations has been pushing in terms of regulatory controls based on climate change for decades now. This White House all in for the climate change policy coming from above, coming from outside this country. And Gregory Wrightstone, he is a geologist, the executive director of the CO2 Coalition in Arlington, Virginia, and he is a best-selling author of Inconvenient Facts, the Science That Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. And he's here today on Bold and Blunt to give us some of the facts we need to understand the deceptions of the infrastructure bill, as well as some of the costs associated with all the climate change regulations this administration wants to push onto America's future generation. So, Greg, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, good to be back on with you. There's a lot of climate change news out there to talk about right now.
Certainly. And let's start with the infrastructure bill. You find that this infrastructure bill that Joe Biden is pushing is just filled with climate change policies.
Yeah, if you and I could probably agree that roads and bridges are truly infrastructure, if that's what we agree, then there's probably 10% of the bill, or $110 billion. Actually, we could point out and say, yeah, that's infrastructure. And there's it's hard to get completely down to the base numbers to what everything is. Looks like there's about the same amount that's dedicated to solve the non-existent climate crisis, the so-called problem. And this is, from being at the CO2 Coalition, our scientists here, we look at it and we see that the modest warming of 0.8 of a degree since 1900, combined with increasing CO2 is leading to Earth's ecosystems and humanity are both thriving and prospering. So we believe that even 1 penny spent to solve a non-existent crisis is 1 penny too much, and certainly $110 billion is way too much.
So where does this bill stand? Because I've read different headlines and read different stories that this is sort of a starting game, but it certainly isn't the $3.5 trillion. It's going to be whittled down. Where do the numbers stand on this bill?
Well, now the infrastructure bill was passed with complicity with the GOP. That $3.2, $3.5 trillion bill is still being negotiated. We've seen outlines of it. It looks bad. I mean, we know they're proposing to get rid of the gasoline tax and have it replaced by mileage-based tax. And they said, oh, well, the gasoline tax will go away. Well, Cheryl, I challenge you to name one tax that's ever gone away. I just moved from Pennsylvania, thankfully, to Florida over the last month. And in Pennsylvania, they still have, if you buy a bottle of liquor in Pennsylvania, you're still paying the Johnstown flood tax. It was to be in place for 5 years, and almost 100 years later, if you go buy a bottle of hooch in the store, you're paying the Johnstown flood tax. So if you think the gasoline tax is going to go away and be replaced by anything else, and also some of our experts here are contending that this new mileage-based fee, if you look at it on a per mileage basis, might be as much as 7 times as high as what the gasoline tax was. So make no mistake, this is going to be very expensive, and it's meant to be. Joe Biden and his administration, their goal is to increase energy costs for all Americans. When you do that, if you think inflation's bad now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because once you increase significantly cost for energy, that means everything else. From manufacturing and then transport for everything you buy in the store, all of those will significantly increase when you're increasing energy costs.
Absolutely. Anything that's driven by trucks, for instance, to get from the producer to the seller, those costs get passed along to the consumer, as you rightly point out. Can you talk a little bit about this mileage fee? Because is it sort of what insurance companies are trying to push, that you pay for the miles that you actually drive? How would that work?
Well, it's not clear exactly the mechanism. The modern cars, they can monitor them, but there will be a lot of people who will elect just to keep their old clunkers and not get an electric vehicle with nothing modern. They're talking about having you have to go into to a shop somewhere, an approved shop, to get your mileage checked. But again, they're not real clear about this. The other thing about Joe's electric vehicle, he issued an executive order last week stipulating that 50% of all vehicles sold in the United States in 2030 would have to be electric vehicles. I'm just in the middle of writing an op-ed right now, commentary on the fire dangers associated with these electric vehicles, and it'll scare you to death. These things, the lithium-ion batteries, can spontaneously combust. It's a very rare event, but it happens. That's why when you go to the post office and you mail a package to your cousin Billy, and they'll always ask, well, do you have lithium-ion batteries? And that's the reason. We've seen recently were two bus stations, one in China and one in Germany. They were charging their buses overnight, and one caught fire, and it led to one bus after another igniting. Both of those bus stations were consumed entirely, and it led to actually two towns in Bavaria that have now banned electric vehicles from parking in parking garages. And we've seen homes that go up while the cars were parked in the garage. You can't put these things out. So it's just think about the horrific consequences. If one of these electric vehicles in an underground parking garage below an office building or an apartment building, well, I mean, it scares me to death. And it's almost inevitable, because these things do happen. Again, it's very rare, but they occur.
Well, rarity aside, it's just the idea of a president with one swoop of a pen practically just mandating that Americans must choose electric vehicles at least 50% of the time going forward over their particular vehicle of choice. It's the idea of individualism being stripped from this society, and the Democrats are using climate change to do this. Am I wrong?
Oh, you're exactly right, but it's not just vehicles. It's every aspect of your life. Do you like heating with natural gas? Nope. Sorry, that's gone. Do you like cooking on your stove with natural gas? Nope. You're going to have all electric. They want to control every aspect of your life. And, we're not that far away from, we're all getting these electric meters. They're not going to be too far away from stipulating how hot you can how hot you can heat your home in the winter, or how cool you can keep it in the summer. It's all to save the planet, because according to them, we're all doomed. The latest UN report said that, and that's just not so. Again, by almost every metric you look at, humanity, the human condition are improving, and Earth's ecosystems are thriving. The Earth is greening and populating. Again, combination of modest warming and increased CO2. But they're trying to stoke, and they've been doing it very successfully, a climate of fear. Because fear is a great motivator.
Absolutely. We've seen that for over a year now with the coronavirus, and they're just simply platforming right back into climate change. And I just have to ask, is there anything I guess freedom-loving Americans should keep in mind when they hear climate change, when they hear environmentalism? What can freedom-loving Americans do to protect their planet that doesn't cede their individual rights to the big bureaucrats? There have to be some common sense middle grounds here.
Well, I get asked that question a lot. In the summary of my book, Inconvenient Facts, I recommended at the time Donald Trump was president that he have the courage to do nothing. And that's what I recommend. If indeed the Earth's ecosystems and humanity are thriving and prospering, what should we do? Probably get out of the way. We're doing pretty good right now. Food and crops, we've got our contributing writer, Vijay Jairaj from Bangalore, India, has just written a beautiful piece on how India's crop production has just been exploding. exploding year after year after year. And it continues this year. They're expecting bumper harvests of grains, rice, corn. And we see that, again, we break crop growth records year after year, and it's because of the warming means that we have longer growing seasons. Killing frosts stop earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall, so we have more plantings. And then that's turbocharged with CO2 enhanced crop growth. CO2 Coalition member Craig Idso reports that we might see a 46, and this is laboratory studies, a 46% increase in crop growth in biomass from the 90 crops he looked at with an increase of CO2 of 300 parts per million. That's a good thing. It's a huge, that should be front page of the New York Times, is the many benefits that we're seeing from increased CO2, but yet they demonize it. Instead of calling it the demon molecule, CO2 should be known as the miracle molecule.
You know what? Thank you for saying that very simple truth. Get out of the way. When something's working, when policies aren't needed, when politicians aren't needed, they should just get out of the way and let nature take its course. And what we're seeing with climate change, though, not just now, but for decades, it's the government's way of controlling people, ultimately.
It is. And, you know, I get asked just about every interview I do, the host invariably asks, well, why are they doing this? And I go back, and Cheryl, I don't know. As a scientist, I can say they're lying to you. This is what they're telling you. This is what the science, the facts, and the data says, and they're at odds with each other on so many of these issues that you hear. I'd advise your people, your listeners, to have a healthy dose of skepticism, doubt the experts, including me. I mean, look up what I have to say. My opinions were drawn from my own personal search for the truth. When as a geologist, I knew some of what we were being told about climate change was wrong, and it was my personal dive and exploration for the truth of climate change that caused me to write my first book and now lead the CO2 Coalition, because it's my mission to get the truth about our thriving Earth out to the population. And I'm optimistic, very optimistic, in that most people I talk to, just random people off the street, have a healthy dose of skepticism. They just don't have the facts to fight it. Right. That's what we're trying to do.
That right there is the sign of a scientist with integrity, when he or she encourages critical thinking and independent research. Because what we've seen under this coronavirus, for instance, has been obey, shut your mouth, obey, obey, obey. And the science has been so selective and random that people are confused, but they're still told to obey. And that's the same thing we see with climate change. You hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the countdown of 12 years that, curiously, and maybe you can answer this for me, Greg, why does that 12 years to doom never change? Why doesn't it ever go down to 11 and then 10 and 9?
Yeah, well, they keep moving. Well, she's got the 12 years right, but it's 12 years until she has to change her prediction. She's got to move out another 12 or 15 or 20 years. These predictions have proved wrong time after time, and they need to stifle people like me and the scientists of the CO2 Coalition. In fact, just last week, for example, I posted data of 10,000 years of temperature data from Greenland ice core, just factual. LinkedIn removed it, said it was false and misleading. It was completely. We had one of our senior fellow, Dr. Patrick Michaels, just a noted climatologist. I posted his 7 bullet points about the UN climate report. Completely factual. Again, LinkedIn removed it and said it was false and misleading. They need to shut people like me up. They need to shut any science up that contradicts their notion of this 97% consensus, and that man's increases in CO2 are leading to catastrophic results, and just the opposite is true.
Let's just finish with this last question. When you look at the Joe Biden administration and its emphasis on climate change and pressing forward regulatory policies on climate change, where do you see America at the end of Joe Biden's administration?
No, it won't be beyond redemption or beyond hope, but he's doing so much damage right now in terms of our energy situation. We're closing nuclear and coal-fired plants, and from our scientists here, it looks like once you've reached about 20% of your electric grid mix, and you start adding more, you're really risking the reliability of that climate grid. Because once we get to that and beyond, we're looking at blackouts and brownouts, and you can't build these facilities overnight. So he might do harm that would take many years to correct, and especially when he's shutting down American oil production, American gas production, and encouraging the Saudis to open up their pipes to encourage Soviet natural gas production to be supplied to Europe. It's harmful, and the chickens are going to come home to roost at some point.
So maybe Americans, if you had to give them some advice, maybe Americans should start stocking up on their batteries and candles now, right, to prepare for the coming brownouts and blackouts.
If you store your batteries, make sure they aren't lithium ion, because you might need a new house. So that's my advice to you. And I'd be careful parking that electric vehicle in your garage.
Greg Wrightstone,
my advice.
I really appreciate your expertise on this. Executive Director of CO2 Coalition. What's the website, please?
CO2coalition.org.
All right. I encourage people to check it out and to listen and read all that Greg has to say. He's one of the honest scientists out there. So thank you so much for your time, Greg.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Well, there's some inconvenient truths for you. Debt in the infrastructure bill